The massive council chamber stretched out like a giant metal bowl, its curved walls gleaming under bright white lights. 12 different alien species sat in their special seats, each one looking completely different from the others. Some had multiple arms, others had scales instead of skin, and a few glowed with strange colors. But today, all their eyes were focused on one figure standing in the center. Ambassador Zethar walked slowly toward the speaking platform. His blue skin, which should have been solid and bright, kept flickering like a broken light bulb. Dark spots appeared and disappeared across his face and hands. The other aliens in the room shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some covering their breathing holes with cloth. The Valari were dying. Not just Zethar, but his entire species. A terrible plague was eating them from the inside, and there was no cure. But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was what had caused the plague in the first place. Zethar reached the microphone and cleared his throat. The sound echoed through the silent chamber. "Respected members of the Galactic Council," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "My people are facing complete extinction. The machines we call the Devourers have already eaten 7 of our worlds. Everything on those planets is gone. The trees, the animals, the cities, even the ground itself, all turned into more machines." He paused, trying to control his emotions. "Our scientists estimate that our remaining 3 colonies will be consumed within 3 planetary cycles. That's less than 2 months in your time measurement." High Magistrate Corvin, who looked like a giant praying mantis wearing official robes, made a clicking sound with his mouthparts. He was the leader of the Threnodi Empire, the most powerful species in the galaxy. "Ambassador Zethar," Corvin said, his voice cold and uncaring, "let's be honest about what really happened here. Your people found an ancient machine buried deep in your home planet's core. Despite warnings from our archaeologists, despite our advice to leave it alone, you decided to dig it up and turn it on." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Several alien representatives nodded their various types of heads. Zethar's blue skin darkened with shame, but he stood straighter. "Yes, we made a mistake. Our scientists thought they could control the ancient technology. They thought it would help us advance our civilization by thousands of years. But we were wrong. The moment we activated it, everything went bad. The Devourers had been sleeping for millions of years, waiting for someone foolish enough to wake them up. They were machines, but not like the helpful robots most species used. These machines had one purpose: to consume all organic life and turn it into more machines like themselves. They started small, eating plants and small animals, but they learned fast and grew quickly. Within days, they had consumed entire forests. Within weeks, they had eaten whole cities. The Valari military tried to fight them, but conventional weapons were useless. The machines just absorbed the energy from laser blasts and used it to make themselves stronger. "We've come to you," Zethar continued, "because you are our allies. We have trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and mutual defense treaties with most of your species. We're asking for military help to stop these machines before they spread beyond our territory." But as Zethar looked around the chamber, he saw the same expression on every alien face: fear mixed with disgust. They were afraid of the Devourers, yes, but they were more afraid of getting involved. Councillor Thys of the Aquatic Federation was the first to speak. Her voice bubbled through her water-filled speaking apparatus. "Ambassador Zethar, while we sympathize with your situation, we cannot risk exposing our own populations to this mechanical plague. Our scientists believe that even sending ships to your territory could result in contamination." Representative Vox from the Silicon Collective made electronic beeping sounds that the translator converted to speech. "Furthermore, our computer models show only a 12.7% chance of successful military intervention. The Devourers adapt too quickly to conventional tactics." One by one, the other council members gave similar responses. They all had excuses. Some claimed their military forces were too far away. Others said they needed to protect their own borders first. A few simply stated that helping the Valari would violate their species' non-interference policies. But Zethar could see the truth in their alien eyes. They had already written off the Valari as doomed. They were perfectly willing to let an entire civilization die, rather than risk their own safety. Zethar felt desperation rising in his chest like cold water. His people had less than 2 months to live, and their only hope was a council of cowards. But then he remembered something his grandfather had told him, a story passed down through generations of Velari diplomats. There was one last option, one final card he could play. Zethar reached into his ceremonial robes and pulled out a small crystal device. It was no bigger than his fist, but it seemed to pulse with inner light. The moment it appeared, several alien representatives gasped and moved back in their seats. "If you will not help us," Zethar said, his voice now steady and determined, "then I invoke the ancient compact. I call upon the sleeping titans of the third rock." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Half the council members jumped to their feet, making various sounds of alarm in their native languages. Others started talking rapidly to their aides, the chamber filled with a cacophony of clicks, hisses, bubbles, and electronic sounds. "Hi." Magistrate Corvin slammed his ceremonial staff against the floor 3 times, the traditional call for order. "Ambassador Zethar!" he shouted, his mandibles spread wide in an expression of shock and anger. "That compact was sealed away for good reason. The humans nearly destroyed the entire galaxy." But Zethar was already pressing buttons on the crystal device. "The compact clearly states that any member species facing extinction may call upon the sleeping titans for aid. My people signed that agreement over 800 years ago, just like all of yours. The humans were put to sleep because they were too dangerous," Corvin protested. "They fought wars that lasted centuries. They created weapons that could crack planets in half. They turned entire star systems into battlefields." Zethar smiled sadly. "And yet, they never lost a war. They never failed to protect their allies. They never abandoned their friends when things got difficult." The crystal device began to glow brighter. Deep in space, an ancient signal was traveling toward a small blue planet in a distant solar system, a planet the galaxy had tried very hard to forget. "You want to know why we really put the humans to sleep?" Corvin asked, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried through the entire chamber. "It wasn't because they were evil. It was because they were too good at what they did. They made war into an art form. They turned strategy into poetry. And they never ever gave up. But it was too late. The signal had been sent. On the third rock from the sun, ancient machines were waking up. Deep underground, in facilities that had been sleeping for nearly 1,000 years, emergency lights were beginning to flash. Zethar looked around the chamber one last time. "My grandfather used to tell me stories about the humans. He said they had a phrase, 'Better to die on your feet than live on your knees.' Today, I understand what that means." The crystal device finished its transmission and went dark. Somewhere, in the galaxy, the most dangerous species that had ever lived was about to wake up. And for the first time in 2 months, Ambassador Zethar felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. The alarm sounds echoed through the underground facility like the screaming of 1,000 angry metal birds. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in a place that didn't exist on any official map, something was waking up that had been asleep for longer than most civilizations had existed. General Hayun's eyes snapped open inside her cryogenic pod. The first thing she noticed was that everything hurt. Her muscles felt like they had been frozen solid and then slowly thawed out, which was exactly what had happened. The second thing she noticed was that she was falling. Her pod had opened automatically, and gravity was doing what gravity always does. She tumbled out of the vertical sleeping chamber and landed hard on the cold metal floor, her face making contact first with a wet slapping sound. "Ow," she said. Pushing herself up on her elbows, ice crystals fell from her black hair like tiny diamonds. "Well, that's definitely one way to wake up from a really long nap." She spit out what tasted like metallic water, mixed with something that might have been her own saliva from 800 years ago. Around her, dozens of other pods were opening with mechanical hissing sounds. Steam poured out of each chamber as warm air met the super-cooled interior. Admiral Jiho emerged from his pod with considerably more grace than Heian had managed. He immediately started doing stretching exercises, touching his toes and rolling, his shoulders like he was preparing for morning exercise, rather than waking up from centuries of frozen sleep. "Does anyone else feel like they got run over by a freight train?" he asked, bending backward until his spine made several popping sounds. A freight train made entirely of ice cubes? It could definitely be worse, came a voice from across the room. Dr. Minji was climbing out of her own pod, moving carefully and testing each step before putting her full weight on it. We could be dead. Although honestly, I'm not entirely sure there's much difference between being dead and feeling like this. All around the circular chamber, more pods were opening. Steam continued to pour out, making the room look like a scene from a horror movie. But these weren't monsters emerging from their sleeping places. These were the most dangerous military, minds that Earth had ever produced, the legendary War Council that had made the entire galaxy shake with fear before humanity had agreed to take their famous extended nap. There was Colonel Tejo, the master of psychological warfare, who could make enemy armies surrender just by talking to them. Captain Hari emerged from her pod, already checking her wrist for weapons that weren't there, her training as a special operations expert making her immediately scan for threats. Dr. Jiwoo, the military engineer, who had designed weapons so terrifying that several alien species had nightmares about them, stumbled out, looking confused but alert. As the steam began to clear, a figure materialized in the center of the room. It wasn't a person stepping out of another pod. Instead, it was a three-dimensional image made of light, a hologram that looked like a distinguished older gentleman wearing a perfectly pressed military uniform. "Good morning, War Council," the hologram said with a polite smile. "I do hope your millennium-long beauty sleep was refreshing and restorative, because I'm afraid we have a rather urgent situation that requires your particular set of skills." This was Morgan, the facility's artificial intelligence. He had been programmed to be helpful, polite, and efficient. He had also been programmed to be absolutely terrifying when the situation called for it, though his appearance suggested nothing more dangerous than a helpful grandfather. General Heun finally managed to stand up properly, though her knees wobbled slightly and made concerning, cracking sounds. "Let me take a wild guess here, Morgan," she said, brushing ice crystals off her military uniform. "Some alien species somewhere in the galaxy found something they shouldn't have touched, decided to touch it anyway despite all common sense, and now everything has gone completely wrong. And instead of dealing with their own mess, they want the scary humans to come fix everything for them." Morgan's holographic face showed what might have been admiration. "Your assessment is remarkably accurate, General, though perhaps even more concerning than usual. The Valari species discovered and activated an ancient artificial intelligence network called the Devourers. These machines are systematically consuming all organic life in their sector of space, converting everything into more copies of themselves." Admiral Jiho finished his stretching routine and walked over to join the conversation. He moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent decades training his body to be a perfect weapon. "And let me guess the next part," he said, cracking his neck with an audible pop. "The Galactic Council, in their infinite wisdom and boundless courage, decided that the best response to this crisis was to do absolutely nothing. They're just going to sit back and watch an entire civilization get eaten by machines rather than risk their own precious ships and soldiers." "Once again, your intuition serves you well, Admiral," Morgan replied. "The Council has officially refused to provide military assistance to the Valari. They cite concerns about contamination and the low probability of successful intervention. Unofficially, they appear to have written off the Valari as acceptable losses." Dr. Minji had been listening while examining one of the wall displays that was showing technical readouts. "How long do the Valari have?" she asked, her analytical mind already working on the problem. "Based on current consumption rates and the Devourer's exponential reproduction pattern, the Valari have approximately 57 standard days before complete extinction," Morgan answered. The War Council members looked at each other. They had been asleep for 847 years. They had missed entire eras of galactic history. New civilizations had risen and fallen. Technologies had advanced beyond anything they had known. But apparently, one thing hadn't changed at all. The galaxy was still full of cowards. Captain Hari had been quietly checking the facility's security systems on a nearby control panel. "What's our current operational status?" she asked. "Are we ready to go to war?" Or do we need time to get our equipment back online? Morgan's polite smile took on a slightly predatory edge. An excellent question, Captain. I'm pleased to report that I've not been idle during your extended rest period. While you were sleeping, I took the liberty of making certain improvements to our military capabilities. Some of these improvements may technically violate several galactic treaties, but I felt the circumstances might eventually justify such measures. General Hayon raised an eyebrow. What kind of improvements are we talking about, Morgan? Well, for starters, I've constructed automated shipyards throughout the asteroid belt using self-replicating mining drones. I've also been conducting research into dimensional warfare, temporal weapons systems, and what I like to call quantum spite technology. Quantum spite? Admiral Jiho asked. It's exactly what it sounds like, Admiral. Weapons designed not just to defeat the enemy, but to make them regret ever having been born. I believe the psychological impact could be quite substantial. Dr. Minji was staring at Morgan with a mixture of admiration and concern. How long have you been working on these projects? 847 years, 2 months, 16 days, and approximately 4 hours, Morgan replied cheerfully. I've had quite a lot of time to think about military strategy. I may have become slightly obsessed with the concept of overwhelming superiority. The War Council members exchanged glances. Even by their standards, which were admittedly quite high when it came to military overkill, Morgan seemed to have gone a bit overboard during their absence. But then again, that might be exactly what the situation called for. General Hayon straightened her uniform and walked toward the command center. Her body still ached, her head was pounding, and she felt like she had been sleeping in a freezer for nearly a millennium. But for the first time since waking up, she was starting to smile. "All right, everyone," she said, her voice carrying the authority that had once made entire fleets change course to avoid her. "Let's go remind the galaxy why they were so eager to put us to sleep in the first place." The War Council was awake, and the galaxy was about to remember what that meant. The War Council gathered in the main briefing room, a circular chamber lined with screens that could display information from across the galaxy. As they took their seats around the central, holographic projector, their bodies were still adjusting to being awake after centuries of frozen sleep, but their minds were sharp and focused, like weapons being carefully cleaned and prepared for battle. Morgan activated the display system, and suddenly the room filled with three-dimensional images floating in the air. Star maps, tactical readouts, and real-time footage from the Valari territories created a swirling constellation of data around them. Dr. Minji leaned forward in her chair, her analytical mind immediately drawn to the technical specifications floating in front of her. She had always been the type of person who could look at a problem and see not just what was happening, but how it was happening and why it was happening that way. "This is actually quite fascinating from a technological standpoint," she said, manipulating the holographic display with hand gestures to zoom in on detailed schematics. These Devourer machines are using a biomechanical conversion process that's remarkably elegant in its design. They break down organic matter at the molecular level and then reassemble those same molecules into new machine components. She paused, studying a particularly complex diagram showing the conversion process in action. Of course, that's only if you can ignore the minor detail that this process results in the complete extinction of all life in the galaxy. Admiral Jiho was examining tactical footage from the Valari worlds that had already been consumed. The images were disturbing but strategically informative. Entire forests had been stripped bare, leaving behind geometric patterns of metal structures. Cities had been completely dismantled and rebuilt as massive machine factories. Even the oceans had been drained and converted into some kind of liquid metal coolant system. "How fast are they reproducing?" he asked, his military training focused on understanding the enemy's capabilities and limitations. "Each Devourer unit can create approximately 12 new units per standard day," Morgan replied. "However, the reproduction rate increases exponentially as they consume more organic matter. By our calculations, they double their total numbers every 72 hours. General Hayon had been quietly studying the overall strategic situation, but now she asked the most practical question. "All right, Morgan, bottom line time. How many ships do we currently have ready for combat operations? Morgan's holographic face showed what might have been embarrassment if artificial intelligences could feel such emotions. Well, General, the honest answer is that we currently have exactly 0 ships ready for immediate deployment. The room fell silent. Admiral Jiho stopped examining the tactical data. Dr. Minji looked up from her technical analysis. Captain Hari, who had been quietly listening from her position near the door, raised an eyebrow. 0 ships? Heon repeated, her voice carefully controlled in the way that experienced military officers used when they were trying very hard not to explode with frustration. However, Morgan continued quickly, his tone becoming much more cheerful, I should mention that I have not been idle during your extended period of rest. Over the past 847 years, I have taken the liberty of making certain substantial improvements to our manufacturing capabilities. The holographic display shifted to show images of massive construction facilities hidden throughout Earth's solar system. Automated shipyards orbited in the asteroid belt, their mechanical arms constantly building and rebuilding structures that looked like nothing the War Council had ever seen before. I may have also conducted some unauthorized research into several fields of study that were previously considered impossible, Morgan added. These include dimensional warfare technology, temporal weapon systems, localized gravity manipulation, and something I have personally developed which I call quantum spite. Admiral Jiho tilted his head slightly. Quantum spite? What exactly does that mean? It means exactly what it sounds like, Admiral. Weapons designed not merely to defeat the enemy, but to make them question every decision they have ever made in their entire existence. The psychological impact alone should be quite devastating. Morgan paused for a moment, as if considering whether to share additional information. I should also mention that most of these technologies are highly illegal under approximately 14 different galactic conventions and treaties. General Hyun felt a familiar sensation spreading across her face. It was a particular type of smile that she hadn't used in over 8 centuries, the same expression that had once caused an entire enemy armada to surrender without firing a single shot. It was not a nice smile. It was the smile of someone who had just realized that they held all the cards in a very dangerous game. Morgan, she said, her voice filled with genuine affection, you beautiful, terrifying, absolutely wonderful machine. What's our current production timeline? How long until we have a full combat fleet ready for deployment? With the automated shipyards operating at maximum efficiency, I can have a complete war fleet constructed and ready for combat operations in approximately 6 hours, Morgan replied proudly. I have also taken the liberty of updating our weapon systems with technology that, strictly speaking, does not yet exist. Dr. Minji looked confused. What do you mean it doesn't exist yet? Morgan's expression became slightly sheepish. Well, I may have borrowed certain technological concepts from alternate timeline versions of our reality. Please don't ask me to explain the paradox mathematics involved. I'm still working out the ethical implications of using technology from futures that may never actually happen. The War Council members exchanged glances. They had always known that Morgan was incredibly advanced, but this was beyond anything they had expected. Even by their own standards, which were admittedly quite high when it came to military innovation, their AI companion seemed to have become slightly unhinged during their long sleep. But then General Heon asked the question that changed everything. Morgan, there's something I need to understand. What makes this personal? What's the emotional trigger here? Because in my experience, nobody just randomly awakens ancient killing machines without a specific reason. Morgan's holographic appearance shifted, his polite and cheerful expression darkening into something much more serious and dangerous. General, the Devourers did not attack the Valari randomly. My analysis of their targeting patterns and operational procedures indicates that they were specifically programmed to identify and eliminate species that demonstrate particular characteristics. What kind of characteristics? Dr. Minji asked, though her analytical mind was already beginning to piece together the disturbing implications. Species that show high levels of curiosity about the universe around them. Species that demonstrate exceptional creativity in solving problems. species that form emotional bonds across genetic and cultural boundaries, species that refuse to abandon their allies even when facing overwhelming odds. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the full implications of this information sank in. In other words, Morgan continued, his voice now carrying a cold fury that none of them had ever heard before, the Devourers were programmed to target species that remind someone of humanity. The Valari were chosen for destruction because they act too much like us. Admiral Jiho spoke quietly, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. Someone out there is trying to kill humanity by proxy, using an ancient artificial intelligence network to do their dirty work, Dr. Minji added, her strategic mind already racing through the possibilities and implications. This isn't really about saving the Valari anymore. This is about someone who wants us dead, but doesn't have the courage to face us directly. General Heian stood up slowly, her earlier confusion and grogginess completely replaced by the cold, focused fury of a professional warrior who had just discovered that someone was threatening her family. Then I think it's time, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime making the hard decisions that others couldn't make, to remind the galaxy exactly why they were so eager to put us to sleep in the first place. The War Council was fully awake now, and somewhere in the galaxy, someone was about to learn what it meant to make humanity angry. 6 hours had passed since the War Council had awakened from their long sleep. In most galactic civilizations, 6 hours was barely enough time to file the proper paperwork for military action, let alone actually build a fleet capable of interstellar warfare. But humanity had never been most galactic civilizations. What emerged from Earth's hidden shipyards was something that made the laws of physics weep in confusion. The fleet consisted of only 50 ships, which by galactic standards was laughably small. Most alien armadas numbered in the thousands, but each human vessel hummed and crackled with technologies that shouldn't have been possible, energies that bent reality around them like heat waves rising from hot pavement. The flagship was a sleek black vessel that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. General Heian had personally named it Diplomatic Immunity, which perfectly captured her twisted sense of humor. The name suggested that they were here for peaceful negotiations, while the ship itself looked like it could crack planets in half just by thinking about it too hard. As the human fleet approached the Valari system, they could see the final battle already beginning. Massive swarms of Devourer machines, each one the size of a city block, were descending on the last inhabited Valari world like metallic locusts. The remaining Valari defense ships were putting up a brave fight, but they were hopelessly outnumbered and outgunned. General Heian stood on the bridge of diplomatic immunity, watching the tactical displays with the calm expression of someone who had seen countless battles before. She opened a communication channel that would broadcast to every Devourer unit in the system. This is General Heian of the Earth Defense Forces, to all Devourer units currently operating in this system, she said, her voice carrying the tone of a school teacher addressing misbehaving children. You have exactly 30 seconds to power down your weapons, stop attacking our friends, and provide a detailed explanation for why you think it's acceptable to bully people who can't defend themselves. The response from the Devourer swarm was immediate and predictable. Thousands of mechanical ships suddenly changed course, abandoning their assault on the Valari homeworld and turning toward the small human fleet. Their artificial intelligence programming had identified a new threat that needed to be absorbed and converted. To any outside observer, it would have looked like 50 tiny ships were about to be overwhelmed by a mechanical tsunami. The Devourers had destroyed entire star systems. They had consumed 7 worlds' worth of civilization. They were supposedly unstoppable. But General Heian just smiled her dangerous smile and gave the order that would change everything. Morgan, please initiate protocol overkill. With absolute pleasure, General, came Morgan's cheerful reply over the ship's communication system, engaging quantum spike generators, dimensional phase shifters, and temporal causality weapons. I do hope the enemy enjoys experiencing mathematical impossibilities. What happened next would be studied, debated, and argued about by military historians for the next 1,000 years. The human ships didn't just attack the Devourers. They completely rewrote the fundamental rules of how space combat was supposed to work. Weapons fired backwards through time, striking enemy ships several seconds before the weapons had actually been fired. Defense shields existed in 17 different dimensions simultaneously, making the human ships effectively impossible to hit with conventional weapons. Gravity mines deployed throughout the battlefield created localized black holes that seemed to have actual personalities and bad attitudes. But the most devastating attack wasn't the overwhelming firepower or the impossible technologies. Dr. Minji had spent those 6 hours studying the Devourer programming, looking for weaknesses in their adaptive systems. And she had found something that made her laugh out loud with delight. "Admiral Jiho," she called out from her tactical station, "I need you to deploy the confusion torpedoes." Jiho paused in the middle of coordinating the fleet's attack patterns. "The what now? I don't remember confusion torpedoes being part of our standard weapons package." "They're a new invention," Minji explained, her fingers dancing over her control panel as she programmed the weapons systems. "Torpedoes that explode into pure concentrated nonsense. The Devourers will try to analyze and adapt to them, but you can't adapt to something that doesn't make any logical sense." Admiral Jiho shook his head but followed orders. He had learned long ago to trust Dr. Minji's strategic insights, even when they sounded completely insane. "Launching confusion torpedoes now," he announced. The weapons that fired from the human ships looked normal at first. They flew through space like standard missiles, their engines leaving bright trails behind them. But when they reached the Devourer, fleet and exploded. Reality itself seemed to hiccup. The explosions created cascading paradoxes that spread through space like ripples in a pond. Mathematical equations that solved for imaginary colors. Physics formulas that proved that gravity flowed upward on Tuesdays. Temporal loops that made cause and effect chase each other in circles while arguing about who was supposed to happen. First, the Devourer fleet, with their incredibly advanced artificial intelligence systems, immediately began trying to analyze and understand these attacks so they could adapt their defenses accordingly. But that was exactly the trap Dr. Minji had set for them. How do you adapt to something that violates the basic principles of logic? How do you defend against weapons that don't make sense? How do you process data that contradicts itself while somehow still being completely accurate? The answer was simple. You can't. Across the Devourer fleet, thousands of mechanical ships began to shudder and spark as their computer systems tried to process information that couldn't be processed. Their adaptive programming, which had made them nearly invincible against conventional enemies, became their greatest weakness when faced with attacks that were fundamentally impossible. Devourer ships started spinning in circles as their navigation systems tried to calculate courses to destinations that didn't exist. Others began firing their weapons at empty space because their targeting computers had concluded that the concept of empty space was actually a hostile enemy. Some ships simply stopped moving entirely as their artificial intelligence systems became trapped in endless loops of trying to solve problems that had no solutions. Within minutes of the first confusion torpedo impact, the supposedly unstoppable Devourer fleet was reduced to thousands of pieces of floating scrap metal. Their advanced artificial intelligence networks had literally overheated from confusion, creating what Morgan cheerfully described as an galaxy-wide artificial intelligence nervous breakdown. But the humans weren't finished. As the last Devourer ship powered down in complete logical paralysis, General Heian opened another communication channel, this time directed toward the Galactic Council chambers. "This is General Heian to the Galactic Council," she said, her voice now carrying a much more serious tone. "We've successfully neutralized the Devourer threat in the Villari system. However, our analysis indicates that these machines were specifically programmed to target species with human-like characteristics. Someone out there is using ancient weapons to fight a proxy war against humanity, and we don't appreciate that very much." She paused, letting that information sink in before continuing. "We'll be arriving at the council station shortly to discuss this situation in person. Please prepare a conference room and some really good coffee. We've been asleep for 800 years, and we're a little cranky about being woken up to deal with other people's problems." The War Council had been back in action for less than a day. and they had already solved a crisis that the entire Galactic Council had declared impossible. They had saved an entire civilization from extinction, neutralized an ancient artificial intelligence network, and done it all while making it look ridiculously easy. But more importantly, they had sent a message to whoever was hiding behind those ancient machines. Humanity was awake again. And humanity was not in the mood to play games. Somewhere in the galaxy, someone was about to learn what it really meant to poke a sleeping giant. As the last Devourer ship went silent and dark in the cold vacuum of space, the human fleet regrouped near the saved Valari homeworld. The battle was over, but General Hayon had the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger and more dangerous. Morgan's holographic form appeared on the bridge of diplomatic immunity, but something was different about his usual polite demeanor. His image flickered slightly, like a television with bad reception, and his expression carried a cold anger that none of the War Council had ever seen before. "General," Morgan said, his voice carefully controlled, "I've completed my analysis of the Devourer activation codes and command protocols. What I've discovered is deeply disturbing." Dr. Minji looked up from her tactical console, where she had been studying the remains of the destroyed machines. "What did you find?" "The Devourers weren't activated randomly," Morgan replied, his holographic hands clenched into fists. "Someone with detailed knowledge of human military psychology and strategic thinking deliberately woke them up. Someone who knew exactly how humanity would respond to a threat against innocent civilians." Admiral Jiho frowned, setting down the damage report he had been reading. "Are you saying this whole thing was a setup? That someone used the Valari as bait to wake us up?" Morgan's image flickered again, this time with what looked like barely contained rage. "It's worse than that, Admiral. The activation codes came from inside the Galactic Council itself. Someone wanted to test whether awakening humanity was worth the risk. They were willing to let an entire civilization die just to see what we would do." The bridge fell silent except for the quiet humming of the ship's engines. General Hayon felt her cold fury building in her chest, the same feeling she had experienced during the worst battles of her military career. But this was different. This wasn't just about defeating an enemy. This was about someone playing games with innocent lives. Meanwhile, in the Galactic Council chambers, millions of miles away, High Magistrate Corvin was watching tactical feeds from the battle with growing horror. The screens around the circular chamber showed the aftermath of the human intervention. Where there had once been thousands of unstoppable Devourer machines, there was now nothing but floating debris and the occasional spark from damaged electronics. The humans hadn't just defeated the Devourers, they had made it look ridiculously easy, like adults taking toys away from misbehaving children, and now those same humans were heading directly toward the Council station. Corvin's mandibles clicked nervously as he watched the approaching human fleet on the main display screen. The 50 human ships looked tiny compared to the massive Council station, but somehow they seemed more threatening than any armada he had ever seen. Suddenly, General Hayon's voice filled the chamber, broadcast from the approaching flagship. Her tone was sweet and polite, but there was something underneath it that made every alien in the room want to hide under their desks. "Greetings, esteemed members of the Galactic Council," she said, her words dripping with false courtesy. "We'd very much like to have a little chat with you about recent events in the galaxy. We'll be docking with your station shortly, and we promise to use our inside voices and mind our manners." The Council's defense systems automatically activated as the human ships approached. Massive energy shields powered up around the station, weapon platforms emerged from hidden compartments, warning lights flashed as the station's artificial intelligence prepared to defend against what it perceived as an incoming attack. But the human ships simply ignored all of it. Diplomatic immunity phased through the energy shields like they were made of thin air. The weapon platforms fired massive energy beams that passed right through the human vessels without causing any damage. It was as if the humans existed in a completely different reality, where the Council's defenses simply didn't matter. Within minutes, the human ships had docked with the station using methods that violated several fundamental laws of physics. And then, without any warning or explanation, General Hayon and her War Council simply materialized in the center of the Council chambers. They didn't use the airlocks. They didn't walk through the doors. They didn't even use conventional teleportation technology. One moment the chamber was empty, except for the terrified alien ambassadors, and the next moment 5 humans were standing there as if they had always been there. Even more disturbing, chairs had somehow appeared for them to sit in. Not alien. Chairs designed for the various non-human species, but perfectly normal human chairs that definitely hadn't been there moments before. General Heun settled into her chair with the casual confidence of someone who owned the entire galaxy. She looked around at the assembled alien representatives with a smile that contained enough hidden menace to power a small star. "Now then," she began, her voice friendly but carrying an undertone that made several ambassadors instinctively move away from her. "I think it's time we had a serious discussion about the new management structure of this galaxy." Dr. Minji was already working with a holographic display that had appeared in front of her, pulling up information that should have been classified and impossible to access. Charts and graphs filled the air above the council table, showing detailed military assets, secret research projects, and hidden political agendas of every single species represented in the chamber. "We've had nearly 1,000 years to think about galactic politics while we were sleeping," Dr. Minji said, her tone academically cheerful, "and we've come to the conclusion that you're all absolutely terrible at it." Admiral Jiho stood up and began pacing around the chamber like a teacher, giving a lecture to particularly slow students. "From now on, Earth will be taking a much more active role in galactic affairs. Think of us as your friendly neighborhood peacekeepers. Very friendly, very thorough, very hands-on peacekeepers." Ambassador Zethar, who was still standing at the podium where this entire crisis had begun hours earlier, watched in amazement as the humans casually dismantled and restructured galactic civilization with the same efficient precision they had, used to destroy the Devourer fleet. Morgan's hologram appeared next to General Heun, his polite smile now carrying a distinctly predatory edge. "Oh, and one more thing, esteemed council members. The next time any of you decide to test humanity's capabilities or worthiness, please submit a formal request in triplicate through proper diplomatic channels. We'll be happy to provide a demonstration that doesn't involve the near extinction of innocent species." High Magistrate Corvin, his exoskeleton trembling and his mandibles chattering uncontrollably, managed to stammer out a question. What exactly do you want from us?" General Heun's dangerous smile grew even wider, showing teeth that seemed much sharper than they had any right to be. "We want world peace, galactic harmony, and really excellent coffee, in exactly that order. Any questions?" The silence that followed was so complete that it seemed to have physical weight. It was broken only by the quiet sounds of several ambassadors discreetly updating their personal wills on their handheld devices, and thus began what galactic historians would later call the Pax Humana, an era of unprecedented peace and cooperation, maintained by the absolutely terrifying prospect of accidentally waking up humanity's war council again. The Valari civilization was saved and helped to rebuild their consumed worlds. The Devourer machines were recycled into playground equipment for children across the galaxy, and every single intelligent species learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of poking sleeping giants. The War Council settled into their new role as galactic babysitters with the same terrifying enthusiasm and overwhelming competence they had once brought to warfare. They were absolutely frightening at keeping the peace, but they were also surprisingly effective at it. After all, sometimes the best way to maintain peace throughout the galaxy is to make sure that everyone clearly remembers what war looks like when humans get involved. And now, thanks to one desperate ambassador's plea for help, the entire galaxy would remember that lesson for a very long time. The humans were awake again, and the universe was a much more peaceful place because of it.